The Harrington family reunion was in full swing at the Grand Meadow Hotel, a 3-day affair that happened once every 5 years, gathering relatives from across the country. The banquet on the second evening was always the centerpiece, a formal dinner where family achievements were celebrated and toasted with an almost ceremonial reverence. Michael Harrington sat at table 7, technically part of the immediate family circle, but positioned just far enough from the head table to feel the deliberate distance. He adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, a nervous habit that had followed him from childhood, and took another sip of water, wishing it were something stronger. From his vantage point, he had a clear view of his father, Richard Harrington, holding court at the center of the head table. At 72, Richard remained an imposing figure, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the confident posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being listened to. Beside him sat Michael's older brother Daniel, 42 to Michael's 38, the golden son whose career in corporate finance had followed the exact blueprint their father had designed decades earlier. The tables between them were filled with cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who served as the loyal audience for the Harrington family mythology, a narrative in which Daniel featured as the protagonist and Michael as, well, Michael wasn't entirely sure what role he played anymore. The creative one who had so much potential, the disappointing one who had chosen a career in education rather than business, the afterthought. He scanned the room, noting how the seating arrangement itself told a story, proximity to Richard indicating status in the family hierarchy. His mother caught his eye from her place beside his father and offered a small smile that somehow conveyed both encouragement and apology. She had always been the bridge between Michael and his father, the translator of their fundamentally different languages. The clinking of metal against glass drew everyone's attention. Richard Harrington had risen to his feet, commanding the room with practiced ease. The murmur of conversation died instantly. "Family," Richard began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the banquet hall. "Once again, we gather to celebrate the Harrington name and all it stands for: excellence, achievement, and legacy." Michael reached for his water glass again, recognizing the familiar opening to what would inevitably become a highlight reel of family accomplishments, with particular emphasis on Daniel's latest triumphs. "Before we enjoy our meal," Richard continued, raising his glass higher, "I want to recognize something special. Today, I stand before you as a proud father, because my son is a true success, in every sense of the word." The room broke into applause, all eyes on Daniel, who smiled modestly. Then, in a moment that would alter the evening's carefully choreographed script, Daniel stood and pointed directly at Michael. "He means my brother," Daniel said clearly. "Michael is the true success." The silence that followed was complete. Forks paused, midway to mouths. Glasses hovered in midair. Richard Harrington's smile froze, a mask of confusion replacing his confident expression. Michael felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes suddenly shift to him, a spotlight he had neither sought nor prepared for. His tie seemed to tighten around his throat. Richard began, then stopped, clearly thrown off his script. He looked from Daniel to Michael and back again, as if trying to decipher some joke he wasn't in on. Daniel remained standing, his arm still extended toward Michael. "Dad was just telling me about the Jefferson Award, right, Dad?" His voice carried a gentle but unmistakable challenge. About Michael's work with at-risk youth in the Chicago school system, the program he developed that's being adopted nationwide. The Jefferson Award. Michael had mentioned it casually to his mother last month, never expecting it to be acknowledged at a family gathering, much less become the subject of a toast. The prestigious education honor had been announced without fanfare, exactly as Michael preferred to live his life, doing meaningful work outside the spotlight. "Yes, of course," Richard recovered, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. The Jefferson, a tremendous achievement. The collective attention of the room remained suspended between the 3 Harrington men. Richard standing with his glass still raised, Daniel pointing toward his brother, and Michael fighting the urge to disappear beneath the white tablecloth. Aunt Elaine, Richard's sister and the family's unofficial historian, broke the tension. "Well, don't keep us in suspense, Michael. Tell us about this award. What exactly did you do to earn such an honor?" Michael cleared his throat. Public speaking had never been his forte, unlike his father and brother who thrived on an audience. "It's really not my brother," Daniel interrupted, lowering his arm but remaining standing. Developed a curriculum for teenagers who've been in the juvenile justice system. It combines education with emotional intelligence training and practical life skills. Pride rang clear in his voice. The recidivism rates for kids in his program dropped 68% in 3 years. 68%. Murmurs rippled through the banquet hall. Genuine sounds of impression and respect. The Jefferson Foundation called it revolutionary, Daniel continued. They're implementing it in 12 cities next year. Michael felt heat rising in his face. His work was his passion, but having it dissected in front of the entire extended family, especially when many of them had previously regarded his career choice with polite dismissal, was excruciating. Well, Richard said, attempting to reclaim control of the moment, this is certainly worth celebrating. To Michael and the Jefferson Award. He raised his glass higher, as if the elevation might compensate for his earlier oversight. Glasses rose throughout the room. To Michael, voices echoed. Michael nodded his acknowledgement, wishing the moment would pass quickly. But Daniel wasn't finished. Actually, Dad, I think you were about to share the other news too. About the funding? Richard's expression flickered again. A mixture of confusion and something else Michael couldn't quite identify. Discomfort? Embarrassment? The Harrington Foundation grant, Daniel prompted. The one the board approved last week. This was news to Michael. The family foundation, established with the fortune Richard had built in commercial real estate, typically funded medical research and arts institutions, prestigious, visible causes that aligned with Richard's view of appropriate family philanthropy. We haven't finalized that decision, Richard said carefully. The vote was unanimous, Dad, Daniel countered, still pleasant but insistent. $3 million over 5 years to expand Michael's program nationally. The largest education grant in the foundation's history. Michael nearly choked on his water. $3 million? His program operated on shoestring budgets and passionate teachers willing to work overtime. That kind of funding would transform everything. The number of students they could reach, the resources they could provide, the data they could gather. But more shocking than the amount was the source. His father's foundation had never shown interest in his work before, had never even asked for a proposal. Richard's smile had become fixed, his knuckles white around his glass. Yes, well, the foundation is always looking for worthy initiatives. Especially those led by family, Daniel added pointedly. Isn't that right, Dad? The banquet proceeded with a strained normalcy after that, courses arriving and being cleared away while conversation flowed around islands of uncomfortable silence. Michael found himself approached by relatives between courses, second cousins and distant aunts, suddenly interested in his work, asking questions that revealed how little they had known or cared about his career before this evening. Teaching troubled kids, his father's cousin Walter mused, pausing beside Michael's chair. Noble work, I suppose, though with your Wharton degree seems a bit of a waste, doesn't it? Before Michael could respond, a voice came from behind them. Actually, Walter, Michael's program saved the state of Illinois approximately $12 million last year in reduced incarceration costs. Daniel had appeared with 2 glasses of scotch, one of which he handed to Michael. I'd call that a pretty good return on a Wharton investment. Walter retreated, muttering congratulations, while Daniel took the empty seat beside his brother. You don't have to defend me, Michael said quietly, though he felt a rush of gratitude for the intervention. Apparently I do, Daniel replied, taking a sip of his scotch, since you won't defend yourself. The brothers sat in silence for a moment, watching the room. Their father was now deep in conversation with Uncle Philip, gesturing emphatically about something that was clearly not Michael or his award. Why did you do that? Michael finally asked. The toast, I mean. And what's this about the foundation grant? Daniel studied his drink. Because it should have been done years ago. And because I'm tired of watching you be invisible in this family. I'm not invisible, Michael protested automatically, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Really? Daniel raised an eyebrow. When's the last time Dad asked you about your work? Not just polite questions at holidays, but really asked? Michael couldn't answer. The truth was, his father had never shown genuine interest in his career. There had been disappointment when Michael declined a position at Harrington Development after business school, followed by years of what could best be described as benign neglect regarding his professional choices. That's what I thought, Daniel said, not unkindly. For what it's worth, the grant is real. I've been pushing for it for months, ever since I read that article about your program in the Tribune. You read that? Of course I read it. You're my brother. Daniel looked at him directly. Just because we don't talk as much as we should, doesn't mean I don't follow what you're doing. Michael felt a complicated mix of emotions: gratitude for his brother's support, lingering hurt from years of being the family afterthought, and confusion about why this revelation was happening now, in such a public setting. The board vote was unanimous, Daniel continued. Even Dad voted yes, though I had to walk him through the proposal 3 times and remind him repeatedly that you're his son, too. The casual cruelty of this truth landed like a physical blow. Michael had always known he was second in his father's estimation, but hearing it stated so plainly still hurt. It doesn't matter, Michael said, draining his scotch. It does matter, Daniel insisted. And it matters that everyone in this family knows what you've accomplished. On your own, without Dad's connections or the Harrington name opening doors. Across the room, their mother was watching them, concern evident in her expression. Michael offered her a reassuring smile, though he felt far from reassured himself. You're going to make a scene, and then we'll all have to deal with Dad's mood for the rest of the weekend, Michael warned. Let him be moody, Daniel replied with surprising vehemence. He spent decades building a monument to himself and calling it family pride. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that the Harrington name isn't just his legacy, it's ours too, and some of us are using it for more than just making money. The undercurrent of anger in Daniel's voice surprised Michael. His brother had always seemed content with his role as the favored son, the keeper of the Harrington business tradition. This new perspective suggested fractures in the golden child narrative that Michael had never suspected. When did you start feeling this way? Michael asked, genuinely curious. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Longer than you'd think. But that's a conversation for somewhere more private than the annual Harrington performance of Aren't We Impressive? As if on cue, the tinkling of a spoon against crystal rang out again. Their father was standing once more, ready to continue the evening's program of toasts and announcements. Brace yourself, Daniel murmured. Round 2 is about to begin. Before we move on to dessert, Richard announced, his composure fully restored. I'd like to acknowledge some other family achievements from the past year. What followed was the familiar Harrington highlight reel, Cousin Stephanie's promotion at her law firm, Uncle Philip's new book publication, the twins' acceptance to Princeton. Each announcement received appropriate applause, each achiever nodding with practiced modesty. And of course, Richard continued, his voice warming noticeably, Harrington Development has had its most successful year to date, breaking ground on the new Chicago riverfront project and expanding into 3 new markets. Daniel tensed beside Michael. This was clearly the moment Richard had been building toward from the beginning. His own achievements, thinly veiled as family success since Daniel was now CEO in title, though Richard remained chairman and the driving force behind major decisions. Under Daniel's leadership, Richard continued, nodding toward his elder son, the company has increased its portfolio value by 30% in just 18 months. Enthusiastic applause followed. Daniel acknowledged it with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. And speaking of leadership, Richard said, I'm pleased to announce that Daniel has recently been appointed to the board of the National Business Council, one of the youngest members in the organization's history. More applause. Michael clapped along, genuinely proud of his brother's accomplishments even while recognizing the stark contrast in how they were celebrated compared to his own. I've always known, Richard went on, his voice taking on the sentimental tone he reserved for important pronouncements, that the Harrington legacy would be secure in Daniel's hands. When a father sees his values, his vision, his very approach to life reflected in his son, well, there's no greater satisfaction. Michael felt Daniel go completely still beside him, the tension in his brother's body almost palpable. Dad, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the room despite its measured tone. I think you're forgetting something important. Richard paused, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation at the interruption. What's that, son? You have 2 sons, Daniel said simply. And while I appreciate your confidence in me, I think it's worth noting that the Harrington legacy isn't just about business success or board appointments. A ripple of uncomfortable awareness moved through the room. This was not part of the usual script. "Of course," Richard said quickly, though his smile had tightened. "As we acknowledged earlier, Michael's educational work is quite commendable." "It's more than commendable," Daniel countered, rising to his feet again. "It's transformative, and it embodies values that should be central to the Harrington legacy: compassion, innovation, and genuine social impact." The tension in the room was electric now. Most family members were watching the exchange with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a car crash in slow motion. "Daniel," Richard said, a warning note in his voice, "perhaps this isn't the appropriate forum for honoring both your sons equally?" Daniel finished. "I disagree. I think it's exactly the right forum, since the entire family is here to witness it." Michael wanted to disappear. Being overlooked was painful, but somehow this public championing felt even worse, exposing the family's dysfunction for everyone to see. "Michael," he said, placing a hand on his brother's arm. "It's fine, really." But Daniel shook off his hand. "It's not fine. It's never been fine, and I've been complicit in it for too long." He turned to address the room at large. "For anyone who might be interested in what actually matters, my brother's program doesn't just keep kids out of prison, though that alone would be achievement enough. It gives them a future. It helps them discover their own worth in a world that's written them off." Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued, passion evident in every word. "Last month, I visited Michael's school in Chicago. I met his students, kids who have survived things none of us could imagine. And I watched my brother transform a classroom of defensive, distrustful teenagers into engaged, hopeful young adults in the span of a single hour." The room was completely silent now, all attention focused on Daniel's unexpected testimony. "That," Daniel concluded, looking directly at their father, "is a legacy to be proud of. That is success that matters." Richard Harrington stood frozen at the head table, his carefully orchestrated evening veering wildly off course, his usual command of the room suddenly uncertain. A painful silence hung over the banquet hall, broken only by the sound of a waiter accidentally dropping a spoon in the far corner. Richard Harrington remained standing, his expression unreadable, while Daniel's challenge hovered in the air between them. It was their mother, Catherine, who finally broke the impasse. She rose gracefully from her seat beside Richard and moved to stand between her husband and elder son. "I think what we're all witnessing," she said, her voice warm but firm, "is a family that cares deeply about legacy, but perhaps defines it differently across generations." She turned to include the room in her gaze. "Richard built Harrington Development from nothing, creating opportunities and security for all of us. Daniel has taken that foundation and expanded it in new directions. And Michael," here she looked directly at her younger son with undisguised pride, "Michael has chosen to build something different, but equally valuable." Michael felt a rush of gratitude for his mother's diplomatic intervention, even as he recognized the practiced ease with which she smoothed over family conflicts. She had been doing it his entire life, finding ways to bridge the gap between Richard's rigid expectations and Michael's different path. "Perhaps," Catherine suggested, "this is a conversation the immediate family should continue privately. In the meantime, I believe dessert is waiting, and Aunt Julia has prepared a presentation about the family genealogy project." The relief in the room was palpable as waiters immediately began serving chocolate torts and coffee, while Julia bustled forward with her laptop and a determined expression that suggested no family drama would derail her carefully prepared slides on Harrington. Ancestors. As attention shifted, Michael saw his father lean close to Daniel, speaking in low, intense tones. Daniel's expression remained resolute, though he nodded occasionally at whatever Richard was saying. Then, to Michael's surprise, both men began moving toward his table. "Your mother suggests we take a moment in the hotel library," Richard said stiffly when they reached him. Not a request, never that with Richard Harrington, but at least not a public continuation of the uncomfortable scene. Michael nodded and stood, noticing how conversations hushed briefly as the three Harrington men exited the banquet hall together. The weight of family attention felt like a physical pressure between his shoulder blades. The hotel library was blessedly empty, a wood-paneled room with leather armchairs and strategic lighting that created pockets of privacy. Richard closed the door behind them and turned to face his sons. "Would either of you care to explain what that display was about?" he asked, his controlled tone belying the anger evident in his rigid posture. "It wasn't a display," Daniel replied evenly. "It was an overdue correction." Richard's jaw tightened. "Correction? You deliberately undermined me in front of the entire family." "No, Dad," Daniel countered. "I accurately represented Michael's achievements after you failed to do so." "Again," Michael held up his hands. "This really isn't necessary." "It is necessary," Daniel insisted, turning to his brother. "You've spent your entire life accepting crumbs of acknowledgement from him, and it has to stop." "That's an outrageous characterization," Richard protested. "I've always supported both my sons. Financially," Daniel cut in. "You've supported Michael financially, but you've never respected his choices or valued his work." The blunt assessment hung in the air. Michael felt simultaneously exposed and relieved to hear stated aloud what he had felt for decades. Richard's face flushed. "I've never interfered with Michael's career decisions, even when I thought he was making a mistake. And there it is," Daniel said quietly. "You still think his choice was a mistake. Even after the award, even after seeing the impact of his work, you still can't admit that there might be forms of success that don't match your narrow definition." Richard turned to Michael, exasperation evident in his expression. "Are you going to let your brother speak for you indefinitely? You're hardly a child who needs defending." It was a familiar tactic, Richard's way of dismissing criticism by redirecting it. But something had shifted in Michael during the past hour. The public acknowledgement, Daniel's unexpected advocacy, the realization that his work was valued by at least some members of his family, it all combined to strengthen something long dormant within him. "Daniel's right," Michael said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "You've never respected my work, Dad. You've tolerated it at best." Richard stared at him, clearly unprepared for direct confrontation from his usually acquiescent younger son. "That's not true," he said, but the response lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Michael pressed. "When was the last time you asked me about my students, or showed any interest in my curriculum, or acknowledged any achievement that didn't come with a prestigious name attached to it?" Richard Harrington was not a man accustomed to being challenged, particularly by his own family. He moved to one of the leather armchairs and sat down heavily, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge the conversation would not be as brief or dismissible as he might have hoped. "I've always wanted what's best for both of you," he said after a moment. "Always." "I believe that," Michael replied, taking the chair opposite his father, while Daniel remained standing. "But you've only ever had one definition of best, your definition." Richard's gaze shifted to the dark window, where his reflection stared back at him. Is it so wrong for a father to want his sons to build on what he created, to want security and respect for them? "There's nothing wrong with wanting those things," Michael acknowledged. "But there's something fundamentally wrong with measuring your son's worth by how closely they follow your exact path." Daniel moved to stand beside Michael's chair, a physical representation of the alliance that had unexpectedly formed between the brothers. "Dad, do you have any idea what Michael actually does every day? The lives he's changing?" Richard's expression tightened. "I understand he teaches, develops curricula. The award makes clear he does it well. He does so much more than that," Daniel insisted. "When I visited his school, I met a 16-year-old named Marcus who had been arrested 4 times before he turned 15. This kid told me that Michael was the first adult who ever made him feel smart, the first person who convinced him he had options beyond gangs or jail." Michael looked up at his brother in surprise. Daniel had never mentioned this conversation during his visit. "Marcus is applying to community college now," Daniel continued. "He wants to become a social worker, to do for other kids what Michael did for him." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "That's legacy, Dad. That's the Harrington name, meaning something beyond business success or social status." Richard sat silently, his expression unreadable. "The thing is," Michael said quietly, "I've never needed you to think my work is better than Daniel's or more important than what you built. I've just needed you to see its value on its own terms, and to acknowledge it publicly," Daniel added, "the way you've always acknowledged my achievements." Richard looked between his sons, something shifting in his expression. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. Perhaps I've been narrow in my perspective, he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. The business has always been my measure of success because it's what I know, what I built from nothing. We understand that, Michael said, surprised by his father's momentary vulnerability. But, Richard continued, straightening slightly, that doesn't excuse the disparity in how I've recognized your accomplishments. For that, I owe you an apology, Michael. The words hung in the air, unprecedented in Michael's experience. His father had never apologized to him for anything in his entire life. Thank you, Michael said simply, unsure how else to respond to this unexpected admission. An uncomfortable silence filled the room as all three men found themselves in unfamiliar emotional territory. It was Daniel who finally broke it, ever the pragmatist. So what happens now? He asked. We can't just go back to the banquet and pretend none of this happened. Richard nodded slowly. No, we can't. He looked directly at Michael. The foundation grant that Daniel mentioned. It's real and it was unanimously approved. But I want you to know that I didn't just vote yes as a favor to your brother. I read the proposal. It's impressive work. You read it? Michael couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. 3 times, Richard confirmed. I may not have understood all the educational terminology, but the outcomes data is undeniable. He hesitated. I should have told you myself. I should have made that announcement tonight instead of focusing exclusively on Harrington development, Daniel finished when his father trailed off. Yes, Richard acknowledged. He stood up, decision evident in his posture. And that's an oversight I intend to correct right now. Michael felt a flicker of alarm. Dad, you don't need to. I do need to, Richard interrupted with unexpected gentleness. Not just for you, but for me, and for this family. He moved toward the door. Some corrections can't wait for privacy. Not when the original error was so public. As his father and brother headed for the door, Michael remained seated, trying to process the seismic shift that had occurred in the space of a single evening. Years of quiet resignation to his place in the family hierarchy had not prepared him for this moment of potential transformation. Coming? Daniel asked, pausing at the threshold. Michael nodded and rose, straightening his tie one final time. Not from nervousness now, but in preparation for a new kind of visibility within his family. When the 3 Harrington men re-entered the banquet hall, Julia was midway through an elaborate explanation of a recently discovered ancestral connection to a minor Civil War general. She faltered briefly as heads turned to track their return, but recovered admirably and continued her presentation while Richard, Daniel, and Michael made their way to their respective seats. Catherine studied their faces intently as they separated, clearly trying to gauge the outcome of their private discussion. Michael offered her a small smile of reassurance as he passed the head table on his way back to table 7. He had barely settled into his chair when his father rose once more and gently interrupted Julia's genealogical enthusiasms. Thank you, Julia, for that fascinating history, Richard said smoothly. Before we conclude the formal portion of our evening, I find I have one more important matter to address. The room quieted immediately, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Michael felt eyes shifting in his direction, the family collectively holding its breath. Earlier this evening, Richard began, his voice strong and clear. I made an announcement about my son being a true success. In doing so, I inadvertently created confusion, which Daniel rightfully corrected. He paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. What I should have said, what I want to say clearly now, is that I am fortunate enough to have 2 sons who represent success in different but equally valuable ways. Michael sat perfectly still, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. His father had never spoken of him this way, certainly not in such a public forum. Most of you know about Daniel's accomplishments with Harrington Development, Richard continued. His business acumen and leadership have taken what I built and expanded it beyond what I could have imagined. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement, but his expression made it clear he was waiting for what would come next. What many of you may not know, Richard said, turning slightly to face Michael directly, is that my younger son has built something equally remarkable, though in a different arena entirely. With uncharacteristic humility, Richard proceeded to outline Michael's work. Not just the award and the statistics, but the philosophy behind the program, the individual success stories, the systemic changes it was beginning to inspire in education and juvenile justice. He spoke with a depth of understanding that suggested he had indeed read the Foundation proposal thoroughly, perhaps more than 3 times. The Jefferson Award recognizes Michael's innovation, Richard concluded, but it cannot fully capture what his work represents. A profound commitment to seeing potential where others see only problems, to offering second chances where the system typically offers only punishment. He raised his glass once more. So I would like to properly toast both my sons tonight. To Daniel, who continues to build our family's business legacy, and to Michael, who reminds us that the true measure of the Harrington name lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we serve. The applause that followed felt different to Michael than the obligatory recognition from earlier in the evening. It carried a warmth and genuineness that suggested the family was responding not just to his achievements, but to the rare vulnerability and growth his father had just displayed. As the formal program concluded, and guests began to mingle more freely, Michael found himself approached by relatives with questions that went beyond polite interest. Cousins asking about volunteer opportunities with his program, an uncle who mentioned a similar initiative in his community, a distant relation who was studying education policy and wanted to discuss methodology. His mother appeared at his side during a brief moment alone, slipping her arm through his. "That couldn't have been easy for him," she said quietly, nodding toward Richard, who was now engaged in conversation with some of the older family members. "No," Michael agreed. "It wasn't. He meant it, you know," she added. "Every word. He's been reading articles about your work for years, keeping a file in his study. He just couldn't find a way to bridge the gap he'd created." This revelation stunned Michael almost more than his father's public acknowledgement. "He has a file? About my work?" Catherine nodded. "People are complicated, Michael. Even Richard Harrington." She squeezed his arm gently. "Especially Richard Harrington." Before Michael could process this new information, Daniel appeared with fresh drinks for both of them. "So," he said, handing Michael a scotch, "that went better than expected." "Thanks to you," Michael acknowledged, "for starting it all with that toast." Daniel shook his head. "It was long overdue, and it doesn't erase decades of imbalance." "No," Michael agreed, "but it's a start." The brothers stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the room where the Harrington family narrative had begun, however tentatively, to expand beyond its rigid former boundaries. The remainder of the reunion weekend unfolded with a subtly altered dynamic. Nothing dramatic. The Harringtons were still Harringtons after all, with their ingrained reserve and careful social calibration. But Michael noticed small shifts that suggested a realignment was underway. At Saturday morning's family breakfast, his father took the seat beside him, rather than his usual place between Daniel and Uncle Philip. The conversation began awkwardly, with Richard asking stiff questions about educational methodologies that revealed both his genuine interest and his unfamiliarity with Michael's professional world. "You don't have to become an expert on education reform overnight, Dad," Michael finally said with a gentle smile. "Maybe just start by asking me what my typical day looks like." Relief flickered across Richard's face. "That sounds reasonable. So what does your typical day look like?" Michael described his morning check-ins with students who had particularly challenging home situations, the advisory group he led for 12 boys with anger management issues, the weekly staff meetings where teachers collaborated on approaches for specific students. "It sounds intense," Richard observed. "Very different from running a business, where at least the quarterly reports follow predictable patterns. Human development isn't as easily quantifiable," Michael acknowledged. "But there are patterns there too, once you know what to look for." His father nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to visit sometime, see your program in action, if that wouldn't be disruptive." The offer hung between them, tentative, unprecedented. "I'd like that," Michael said, surprised by how much he meant it. Across the table, he caught Daniel watching their exchange with an expression of cautious optimism. Later that afternoon, during the family softball game, another Harrington tradition that combined recreation with inevitable competitiveness, Michael found himself paired with Daniel on the same team for the first time in years. Usually, the brothers were deliberately placed on opposing sides, part of Richard's long-standing strategy to build healthy competition between his sons. "Dad's idea," Daniel explained when Michael raised an eyebrow at the team assignment. "He said something about recognizing complementary strengths, and Modeling collaborative leadership. I think he's been reading management books again. Michael laughed. Baby steps, I guess. As they warmed up, tossing a ball back and forth on the sidelines, Daniel broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them since the previous evening. I should have done that years ago, he said abruptly. Called him out on how he treats you. I'm sorry it took so long. Michael caught the ball and held it, considering his response. Why did you do it now? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Honestly? Because I'm tired. Tired of the role I've been playing in this family. Tired of watching you accept less than you deserve. Tired of pretending Dad's way is the only way to measure a life. He scuffed the grass with his shoe, a boyhood gesture that made him suddenly look younger than his 42 years. And because last month, when I visited your school, one of your colleagues asked if we were really brothers. She said we seem nothing alike. Sarah tends to be blunt, Michael acknowledged, remembering the conversation. She said I seemed like a corporate robot, while you were actually human. Daniel continued with a rueful smile. It stung because there was truth in it. I've spent so long trying to be exactly what Dad wanted that I'm not sure who I am outside of that identity. This level of vulnerability from his usually self-assured brother was unprecedented. Michael tossed the ball back gently. Well, the good news is, you're definitely not a robot, he offered. Robots don't stage public interventions at family banquets. Daniel caught the ball with a short laugh. No, I suppose they don't. For what it's worth, Michael added more seriously, I've always been a little envious of your certainty, knowing exactly what you wanted and going after it. It wasn't certainty, Daniel corrected. It was the path of least resistance. Dad laid it out. I followed it. He threw the ball with more force. Your path, forging your own way despite his disapproval, that took real courage. Michael caught the ball against his chest, surprised by the admission. The brothers had never spoken this openly about the different trajectories of their lives, the unspoken competition that had defined their relationship since childhood. Maybe we've both had the wrong idea about each other all these years, Michael suggested. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe so, and maybe it's not too late to fix that. From across the field, their father called everyone to gather for the start of the game. As they jogged over, Daniel added quietly, just so you know, I meant every word I said about your work. It's not just important, it's vital, and I'm genuinely proud to be your brother. The simple statement, offered without fanfare, meant more to Michael than all the public recognition of the previous evening combined. On Sunday morning, the final day of the reunion, Michael found himself alone with his mother in the hotel garden. They had always shared an appreciation for early hours, and he had known she would be there with her tea, watching the sun climb over the distant hills while the rest of the family slept. You seem different, Catherine observed as he joined her on the stone bench. More at peace. Michael considered this. I think I am, though I'm not entirely sure what to do with this new visibility in the family. His mother smiled. You'll adjust. You've always been adaptable. Had to be, growing up in Richard's shadow. And Daniel's, Michael added, though without the usual edge that accompanied such observations. Yes, Catherine acknowledged. Though that shadow wasn't of Daniel's making. They sat quietly for a moment, steam rising from their cups in the cool morning air. Did you know, Michael finally asked, about the file Dad keeps on my work? Catherine nodded. I'm the one who started it, actually. Years ago, when you first began developing your program, Richard would never have sought out the information himself, but he read everything I left on his desk. Michael tried to reconcile this revelation with his long-held image of his father's dismissive attitude toward his career. He never said anything. Your father, Catherine said carefully, has spent his entire life believing in a very specific definition of success. Admitting that his son had found a different, equally valid path would have required him to question his own choices, his own values. And the foundation grant, was that your doing too? She shook her head. That was all Daniel. He's been watching you more closely than you realize, especially this past year. Michael recalled his brother's words from the softball field, the admission of envy, of questioning his own path. It seemed both Harrington's sons had been reassessing their positions in the family mythology. What happens now? He asked, echoing Daniel's question from the library. Catherine considered this. That depends on all three of you. Your father has taken a first step, but real change will require sustained effort. From him, certainly, but from you and Daniel as well. Me? Michael was surprised. What do I need to change? His mother gave him a knowing look. You've spent years defining yourself in opposition to your father and brother, the different Harrington, the one who rejected the family business and all it stands for. Michael started to protest, but Catherine held up a hand. It was a necessary rebellion, and I've always supported your path. But there's a difference between making independent choices and making choices specifically to prove you're not like them. The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Michael had never articulated it, even to himself, but there had been moments in his career when his decisions were influenced not just by what he wanted to do, but by what would most clearly differentiate him from the Harrington mold. The foundation grant will change things, Catherine continued. You'll be more directly connected to the family resources, more visible within the Harrington orbit. Are you prepared for that? It was a question Michael hadn't fully considered. The grant would indeed create new intersections between his carefully separated professional life and the family identity he had spent years distancing himself from. I don't know, he admitted. That's an honest answer at least, Catherine said with approval. Just remember that accepting support, even from your father, doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy. And allowing yourself to be more integrated into the family doesn't diminish what you've built on your own. From inside the hotel came the sounds of the family stirring, doors opening and closing, voices calling down hallways, the background noise of 30 Harringtons preparing for their final day together. I should go help with the breakfast coordination, Catherine said, rising from the bench. Your father becomes insufferable when the schedule runs behind. Michael smiled at this familiar observation. Some things about the Harringtons would never change, regardless of recent breakthroughs. As his mother turned to go, she paused and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. You know, Michael, success isn't just about what you accomplish. It's also about who you become in the process. She looked back toward the hotel, where Daniel could now be seen through a window, gesturing emphatically while on his phone. Both my sons are successful by that measure, and both still have room to grow. With that, she left him to his thoughts and the remaining minutes of morning quiet before the day's activities began. The final event of the Harrington family reunion was always Sunday lunch, a slightly more casual affair than Friday's banquet, though casual in Harrington terms, still involved linen napkins and 3 courses. As families prepared to disperse back to their respective homes across the country, the conversation carried the wistful quality of impending separation mixed with relief at returning to normal life. Michael sat between his cousin Rebecca, a pediatric surgeon from Seattle whom he had always liked, and his teenage nephew Owen, Daniel's oldest son who was visiting colleges during the upcoming fall. Dad says I should look at your program when I'm in Chicago next month, Owen said as they waited for dessert. He thinks I should see what you do before I decide on a major. Michael nearly choked on his water. Daniel had never suggested his children explore career paths outside the business finance law trifecta that dominated the Harrington professional landscape. I'd be happy to show you around, he managed. Though I should warn you, education isn't exactly the fast track to Harrington-level wealth. Owen shrugged. Yeah, Dad mentioned that too. He said some things matter more than money, which was weird coming from him. The teenager looked genuinely confused by this apparent contradiction in his father's worldview. Your dad is full of surprises lately, Michael agreed, catching Daniel's eye across the room and receiving a small nod of acknowledgement. As lunch concluded, Richard stood to deliver the traditional closing remarks, typically a brief reflection on family bonds and an encouragement to uphold the Harrington standard of excellence until the next gathering. Before we part ways, he began, I want to thank everyone for making this reunion another memorable chapter in our family's story. The usual platitudes followed. Gratitude to those who had traveled farthest, recognition of the oldest and youngest family members present, appreciation for the hotel staff. But then Richard's tone shifted slightly. Traditions are important, he continued. They connect us to our past and provide continuity in an ever-changing world. The Harrington family has many proud traditions, as this weekend has demonstrated. Michael tensed slightly, recognizing the familiar preamble to his father's legacy speech. But this weekend has also reminded me Richard went on, surprising everyone, that traditions must evolve if they are to remain relevant and meaningful. A murmur of interest rippled through the gathering. This was decidedly off-script for Richard Harrington. For many years, I have defined the Harrington legacy primarily in terms of business success and financial achievement, Richard acknowledged. Those remain important markers, certainly, but they are incomplete measures of what this family stands for, or what it could stand for in the future. His gaze moved deliberately to Michael, then to Daniel, and finally to his grandchildren scattered throughout the room. I've had the privilege of building a successful company, he said. Daniel has expanded that success in ways I never imagined. And Michael, here he paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care. Michael has shown us that the Harrington name can represent not just wealth creation, but genuine social transformation. The acknowledgement, delivered without qualification or comparative language, landed like a gift. Michael felt something tight and defensive within him begin to unwind. As we look to the future, Richard continued, I challenge each of us to consider what legacy truly means. Not just what we accumulate or achieve, but what we contribute, how we use the privileges and opportunities that come with the Harrington name. He raised his water glass in a final toast. To the Harrington family, past, present, and a future that may surprise us all. As glasses lifted around the room, Michael caught his brother's eye again. Daniel raised his glass slightly higher, a private acknowledgement between them. Whatever came next, for the family and for their relationship, would be uncharted territory. But for the first time in his adult life, Michael felt fully present in the Harrington circle, neither invisibly overlooked nor defiantly separate. After the toast, as families began their goodbyes, Richard approached Michael directly. That grant proposal, he said without preamble. I'd like to be more involved than just signing off on the funding. Michael blinked in surprise. Involved how? I'm not entirely sure, his father admitted, with uncharacteristic uncertainty. But I have some experience in organizational development, budget management. Perhaps there are aspects where I could offer useful input. The suggestion hovered between them. Not just an olive branch, but an actual request for connection, for shared purpose. We could start with a proper tour of the program, Michael suggested, then see where that leads. Richard nodded, relief evident in his expression. I'd like that. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Richard Harrington would never be an effusive, demonstrative father, but it was a genuine beginning. A recognition, however belated, that the path to reconciliation required mutual steps. 6 months later, Michael stood in the newly renovated community center attached to his school, watching as students led small groups of visitors through the space, explaining the program's philosophy and their own experiences with evident pride. The official opening ceremony would begin in 20 minutes, marking the formal launch of the expanded initiative funded by the Harrington Foundation grant. Impressive, Daniel said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee from the refreshment table. Both the space and the kids, especially that young man over there. Marcus, right? Michael nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. He's been practicing his presentation for weeks, terrified but determined. They watched as Marcus, now 17 and in his senior year, guided a group that included 2 state legislators and the city's deputy mayor through the tech lab, gesturing animatedly as he explained the coding program he had helped develop. Hard to believe that's the same angry kid I met last year, Daniel observed. People can change when given the right opportunities, Michael replied, the statement carrying implications beyond his students. The brothers stood in companionable silence, observing the controlled chaos of the open house. The past 6 months had brought gradual but significant shifts in their relationship. Regular phone calls, occasional dinners when business brought Daniel to Chicago, even a weekend fishing trip that had started awkwardly but ended with a deeper understanding between them. Dad just arrived, Daniel said, nodding toward the entrance where Richard Harrington was handing his coat to an attentive student volunteer. He looks nervous. He is nervous, Michael confirmed. He's going to say a few words during the ceremony, and public speaking to an audience that isn't composed of business associates is apparently terrifying. Daniel raised his eyebrows in surprise. He's speaking? That wasn't in the program I saw. Last-minute addition, Michael explained. His idea, actually. Their father spotted them and made his way across the room, navigating around student displays and visitor groups with determined efficiency. "Traffic was abysmal," he announced by way of greeting. "But the building looks excellent. Very professional." Coming from Richard Harrington, this was high praise indeed. Michael had been surprised by his father's genuine engagement with the project over the past months, starting with that promised tour, which had led to regular check-ins, practical suggestions about the renovation, and eventually, actual conversations with students. "The contractors finished on schedule and under budget," Michael reported, knowing his father would appreciate this detail. "And student enrollment is up 30% from last semester." Richard nodded approvingly. "Excellent metrics. And retention rates?" "Holding steady at 92%, Michael said, "which is practically unheard of for this population." "Your brother has been keeping me updated on the financial aspects," Richard told him. "The foundation board is very impressed with the return on investment, both in terms of immediate outcomes and long-term societal impact." Michael glanced at Daniel, who shrugged slightly. "I may have made a few presentations emphasizing the economic benefits of your approach. Reduced incarceration costs, increased tax base from employment, that sort of thing. Speaking their language." "Our language," Richard corrected mildly. "Business metrics matter, even in social programs. Sustainability requires both idealism and pragmatism." Before Michael could respond to this unexpected philosophical observation from his usually bottom-line focused father, the school principal approached to inform them it was time to begin the ceremony. The community center's main hall had been arranged with chairs facing a small stage. As Michael moved to take his place at the podium, he scanned the gathering crowd, students and their families, teachers, community partners, local officials, and foundation representatives. In the front row sat his mother, elegant as always, beside Daniel and his wife Jennifer. Richard stood slightly apart, reviewing what appeared to be note cards, his expression focused. The ceremony proceeded according to plan. Welcome remarks from the principal, a brief video showcasing student success stories, acknowledgments of key donors and partners. When it came time for Michael to speak, he found himself unexpectedly emotional, looking out at the tangible manifestation of work that had once existed only in his imagination. "What you see today," he told the audience, "represents not just a physical space but a fundamental belief that every young person deserves the chance to rewrite their story, to discover their own definition of success." As he continued his remarks, Michael caught his father watching him intently, nodding occasionally in a way that suggested not just polite attention, but genuine engagement with the ideas being expressed. When Michael introduced Richard as the representative of the Harrington Foundation, he saw a momentary surprise flicker across many faces. Those who knew both men well enough to understand the significance of Richard's presence at his younger son's professional milestone. Richard approached the podium with his characteristic confidence, but as he arranged his notes, Michael noticed a slight tremor in his father's hands, a rare sign of nerves from a man who had addressed boardrooms and business conferences with unshakable composure for decades. "Thank you, Michael," Richard began formally, "and thank you to everyone who has made this remarkable program possible." He looked down at his notes, then deliberately set them aside. "I had prepared remarks about the Foundation's commitment to educational innovation and community investment," he said. "But standing here today, watching these extraordinary young people present their work with such confidence and clarity, I find myself wanting to speak more personally." Michael felt his mother and brother both glance at him, their surprise matching his own. Richard Harrington did not speak personally at public events, or indeed at most private ones. "Many of you know me primarily as a businessman," Richard continued. "Some of you may know me as Michael's father. Very few of you know that for most of my son's career, I failed to fully appreciate the importance and impact of his work." A hushed stillness fell over the room. This level of vulnerability from Richard Harrington was unprecedented. "It is a particular type of blindness," he acknowledged, "to value only what you understand, only what resembles your own path. I suffered from that blindness for many years." He turned slightly to include Michael in his gaze. "Fortunately, I had a son persistent enough to forge his own path despite my limited vision, and another son brave enough to call attention to that limitation when it needed to be addressed." The personal admission, delivered in such a public forum, left Michael momentarily speechless. He saw his mother dab discreetly at her eyes, while Daniel sat straighter in his chair, his expression a complex mixture of surprise and vindication. "The Harrington Foundation is proud to support this program," Richard concluded, his voice regaining its usual authoritative tone. "Not just because the metrics demonstrate its effectiveness, though they certainly do, but because it represents the kind of legacy any family should aspire to build. One that creates opportunity, fosters potential, and recognizes that success has many definitions, all of them valid." As Richard stepped back from the podium to unexpectedly vigorous applause, Michael felt something shift within him. A tension he had carried for so long that it had become part of his identity, finally beginning to release. The ceremony continued with student speakers and a ribbon cutting, but Michael found himself watching his father, who stood now between Catherine and Daniel, the three of them forming a united front of family support that had never before been present in his professional life. When Marcus took the podium as the final student speaker, Michael saw his father lean forward slightly, listening with genuine interest as the teenager described how the program had changed his life's trajectory. "Before I met Mr. Harrington," Marcus said, gesturing toward Michael, "I thought success meant money, power, respect, the kind you get from fear, you know? But he showed me there's another kind of success, the kind that comes from building something that helps others build themselves." Richard caught Michael's eye across the room and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps, after all these years, father and son had finally found common ground in the wisdom of a 17-year-old formerly incarcerated student who understood what truly constituted success. After the ceremony, the community center hummed with conversation as guests explored the new facilities and engaged with student demonstrations. Michael found himself moving from group to group, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about program expansion, barely registering the persistent buzz of his phone in his pocket. It was Daniel who finally cornered him near the art installation created by the advanced design class. "You might want to check your messages," he said, a strange expression on his face. "The Chicago Tribune just published their piece on the program." Michael frowned, pulling out his phone. "It wasn't supposed to go live until tomorrow." "Well, it's live now," Daniel replied, "and it's significant." The Tribune article had been in development for weeks, a feature on innovative approaches to juvenile justice that would highlight Michael's program as a case study. He'd done several interviews, arranged for the reporter to observe classes and speak with students. It was expected to be positive coverage, but hardly breaking news. Michael opened the link Daniel had texted him and froze when he saw the headline, "Harrington Education Initiative, a new model for corporate philanthropy and social impact." The article wasn't just about his program, it was about the partnership between the program and the Harrington Foundation, featuring extensive quotes from Richard about the foundation's strategic pivot toward impact-focused giving and its commitment to scaling Michael's model nationally. "Did you know about this?" Michael asked his brother, scrolling rapidly through the lengthy piece that positioned the foundation's grant not as a one-off donation, but as the beginning of a major philanthropic initiative centered around his work. "Not the specifics," Daniel admitted, "though Dad's been in a lot of closed-door meetings with the foundation board lately. Jennifer heard rumors about a significant reallocation of resources." Michael continued reading, his disbelief growing. According to the article, the Harrington Foundation was committing $50 million over the next decade to replicate his program in 20 cities nationwide, with Michael positioned as the executive director of the newly established Harrington Education Initiative. "This isn't," he began, looking up at Daniel in confusion. "He never discussed any of this with me." "Classic Dad," Daniel said, though without his usual cynicism. "Make the big decisions, announce them publicly, expect everyone to fall in line with his vision." Michael spotted his father across the room, deep in conversation with the mayor and several business leaders who had attended the ceremony. Richard appeared entirely in his element, commanding, persuasive, the confident philanthropist, rather than the briefly vulnerable father who had spoken so personally during the ceremony. "I need to talk to him," Michael said, already moving in Richard's direction when his phone rang, the Tribune reporter calling for comment on the just-published story. By the time Michael finished providing a carefully non-committal statement about being encouraged by the Foundation's support, While emphasizing that no formal agreements had been finalized, the crowd in the community center had thinned considerably. His father was nowhere to be seen. "He left with Mom about 10 minutes ago," the principal informed him. "Said something about another commitment." Michael felt a familiar frustration rising, the sensation of being simultaneously elevated and diminished by his father's actions. The article positioned him as a visionary educator, while also neatly folding his independent work into the Harrington family enterprise, effectively claiming his success as part of the larger Harrington narrative. He found Daniel waiting by the main entrance, coat already on. "Need a ride? My car's outside." The brothers traveled in silence through Chicago's evening traffic. Michael still processing the implications of the article and his father's unilateral decisions about his professional future. "He means well," Daniel finally said as they neared Michael's apartment building. "In his own, completely dysfunctional way." "Does he?" Michael asked, genuine uncertainty in his voice. "Or is this just another form of control, wrapping my work into the Harrington brand so it becomes part of his legacy rather than my independent achievement?" Daniel considered this. "Probably both," he admitted. "Dad doesn't operate in either-or categories. It's always both and with him. Genuine pride mixed with strategic advantage, sincere admiration complicated by the need to maintain control." He pulled up in front of Michael's building and put the car in park. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Michael stared out at the darkened street, weighing his options. The $50 million would transform his work, reaching thousands more students than he could help on his own. But accepting the role his father had publicly outlined for him would also mean surrendering a degree of autonomy he had fought hard to establish. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "Well, when you figure it out," Daniel said. "Remember, you're not alone in this anymore. Whatever you decide, I've got your back." The simple statement, offered without qualification or advice, represented perhaps the most profound change of the past 6 months. The transition from competitive distance to genuine alliance between the Harrington brothers. As Michael climbed the stairs to his apartment, his phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Call me when you've read the article. We have plans to discuss." Not a request for input or a question about Michael's interest in the proposed initiative. Just the assumption of compliance with a plan already set in motion. Some things about Richard Harrington remained stubbornly unchanged. Michael set the phone down without responding and moved to the window that overlooked the city. 6 months ago, his father's acknowledgement at the reunion banquet had seemed like a transformative moment, the beginning of a new, more balanced relationship. Now he understood that real transformation would require more than words or even gestures. It would demand a fundamental renegotiation of power between them. The question was whether such a renegotiation was possible with a man like his father, and whether Michael himself was prepared to assert his boundaries even at the potential cost of the expanded impact his work could have with Harrington resources behind it. As he stood contemplating this dilemma, his phone lit up again. Not his father this time, but a text from Marcus. "Thank you for everything, Mr. H. You showed me another way was possible." And then there it was, the reason he had built his program in the first place. Not for recognition or empire building or even family approval, but for the Marcuses of the world who needed someone to see their potential. Whatever came next with his father and the foundation, Michael realized, would have to be evaluated against this single criterion. Would it help or hinder his ability to serve the students who needed him most? With that clarity came the beginnings of a decision, not a rejection of his father's offer, but a determination to engage with it on his own terms, as an equal partner rather than a subordinate executing someone else's vision. He picked up his phone and began to compose a response to his father, not an acceptance or a refusal, but an invitation to a conversation between two adult men with different strengths but potentially aligned purposes. "We do indeed have plans to discuss," he wrote. "Let's meet tomorrow. My office, 10 a.m. The small act of naming the location, his territory, not his father's, felt surprisingly significant. A year ago, he would have automatically agreed to meet at Richard's office, accommodating his father's schedule and preferences without question. The response came almost immediately. "I'll be there." 2 simple words, but in them, Michael sensed a new possibility. that perhaps his father too was ready for a different kind of relationship. Not the complete transformation he had briefly imagined after the banquet, but an evolution that acknowledged both the reality of who Richard Harrington was and the man Michael had become. Daniel's parting words echoed in his mind. "You're not alone in this anymore." And that, perhaps, was the most important change of all. The knowledge that whatever path he chose, he would walk it neither in his father's shadow, nor in defiant isolation, but as part of a family finally beginning to recognize the strength in their differences. 1 year later, Michael stood at the edge of a rooftop garden in Detroit, watching as students from the newest Harrington Education Initiative site planted vegetables in raised beds they had designed and built themselves. It was the 4th location to open since the Tribune article had announced the foundation's commitment, with 6 more sites in various stages of development across the country. "The Chicago model is still outperforming the others," Daniel observed, joining him at the railing. "But Detroit is catching up fast." Michael nodded, pride evident in his expression. "They've adapted the curriculum brilliantly for local needs. That's always been the key, not rigid replication, but guided adaptation." The brothers stood in companionable silence, observing the activity below. Their relationship had deepened over the past year, evolving from the tentative reconnection following the reunion to a genuine partnership. Daniel had become the foundation's president, directing its resources with the same strategic acumen he had once applied exclusively to Harrington development, while Michael led the educational initiative as its executive director. "Dad's flight landed," Daniel reported, checking his phone. "He'll be here for the board meeting this afternoon." Michael acknowledged this with a nod, no longer feeling the automatic tension that had once accompanied news of his father's imminent arrival. The past year had brought significant changes in their relationship, not a complete transformation, but a gradual shift toward a more balanced dynamic. The meeting in Michael's office the day after the Tribune article had been a turning point. For the first time in their relationship, Michael had set clear boundaries about his role in the initiative, insisting on operational independence while accepting the strategic oversight of the foundation board. Richard, perhaps recognizing that his son's cooperation was essential to the success of the project, had accepted these terms with unexpected grace. "Have you given any more thought to his suggestion about the book?" Daniel asked. Michael smiled slightly. The book had been Richard's latest project, a proposed volume documenting the methodology and outcomes of the initiative, positioning it as a model for corporate philanthropy nationwide. It was exactly the kind of high-profile achievement Richard valued, combining meaningful impact with public recognition. "I told him I'd consider co-authoring it," Michael replied, "but only if we include substantial input from the students and teachers actually doing the work." Daniel laughed. "Let me guess. He suggested hiring a ghostwriter instead?" "Actually, no," Michael said, still surprised by the memory. "He said my approach would make it more authentic and effective. Then he asked if Marcus would be willing to contribute a chapter." This evolution in his father's thinking, recognizing the value of voices beyond his own, represented perhaps the most significant change of the past year. Richard remained Richard, ambitious, strategic, sometimes domineering, but he had begun to demonstrate a capacity for growth that Michael had never believed possible. A commotion from the garden below drew their attention. One of the students, a girl who had entered the program after 3 suspensions for fighting, was proudly showing off the first sprouts emerging from seeds planted just days earlier. Her face, typically guarded, was transformed by genuine excitement. "That," Michael said quietly, "is what success looks like." Daniel nodded, understanding perfectly what his brother meant. Different from closing a major real estate deal, but no less satisfying. "Different but equal," Michael agreed. "Which is what Dad is finally beginning to understand, I think." As they turned to leave the rooftop and prepare for the board meeting, Michael reflected on the journey of the past 18 months. From the moment of public recognition at the family banquet to this complex, evolving collaboration that combined the best of the Harrington business acumen with his own educational vision. It wasn't the path he had imagined for himself when he first broke away from family expectations to pursue education, nor was it the completely independent course he had maintained for so many years. Instead, it represented something new, a synthesis that honored both his autonomy and his connection to the family that had shaped him, for better and worse. The Harrington Education Initiative now bore both his professional imprint and his family name. No longer a contradiction, but a deliberate integration of identities he had once believed irreconcilable. As they reached the door, Daniel paused. "You know what I realized recently? That moment at the banquet, when I pointed at you after Dad's toast, it changed all of us, not just you." Michael considered this. "How so?" "It forced Dad to see you differently, obviously," Daniel replied. "But it also forced me to stop playing my assigned role as the successful son. And maybe most importantly, it made you stop accepting invisibility as your place in this family." The observation was insightful, typical of the more reflective person Daniel had become since stepping back from the all-consuming demands of running Harrington Development to focus on the foundation. "One moment of truth," Michael mused, "and 18 months of hard work afterward." Daniel laughed. "That's the Harrington way, isn't it? Nothing's ever simple with this family." As they descended the stairs to meet their father, Michael reflected that his brother was right. Nothing about the Harringtons was simple. Not their ambitions, not their conflicts, and certainly not their evolution toward a more honest and equitable family dynamic. But in that complexity, he had found something he had never expected when he sat at table 7 at the reunion banquet, watching his father toast his brother's success, not just visibility within his family, but a genuine integration of his personal values with the Harrington legacy. "My son is a true success," his father had declared that night, meaning Daniel. Now, 18 months later, Richard Harrington had expanded his definition of success enough to genuinely include both his sons, different in their approaches, but united in their impact. And perhaps that was the greatest success of all. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the invisible dynamics in your own family or professional life. Like Michael, many of us struggle with being truly seen for who we are and what we contribute, especially when we don't fit neatly into others' expectations. Consider whether there are relationships in your life that might benefit from the kind of honest conversation Michael and his family finally had. Conversations that acknowledge long-standing patterns and open the door to new possibilities. Sometimes a single moment of truth, like Daniel pointing to his overlooked brother, can become the catalyst for meaningful change. Remember that transformation rarely happens overnight. The Harrington family's journey took time, persistence, and willingness from all parties to step outside their comfortable roles. Real change requires not just acknowledgement, but ongoing effort to create new patterns of interaction. If you've ever felt invisible in your family, workplace, or community, know that your contributions matter, even when they're not being publicly celebrated. And if you've witnessed someone else being overlooked, consider the powerful impact of simply saying, "Look there." That's what success really looks like. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore family dynamics, personal growth, and finding authentic recognition in a world that often values only certain types of achievement. Next week, we'll share another powerful narrative about reconciliation and discovering unexpected common ground with those we thought could never understand us. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, may you both see and be seen for who you truly are.